Walls of Destiny. Part 1. Chapter 11. The Hour of Destiny. As they rode along the tracks, they felt the warm winds blowing from the south, lifting their spirits. Mylo could see nearly all of Lake Tyre to the south. The smell of the brackish water reminded him of his times fishing on such a lake. He silently swore that if he got out of this in one piece, the first thing he'd do is go on a fishing trip, and with a renewed sense of appreciation for such simple things of life. After several hours of riding, the two horsemen that were sent ahead to scout had returned. They spoke to Andanine in the language of the people of the cliffs. They have spotted a camp, about a half-mile ahead, announced Andanine. Losgrel directed the others to remain off to the side of the road while he and Burdock rode ahead to better assess the situation. The path transitioned from a relatively level surface to a slight incline dotted with many mounds and knolls further to the east. Spotting the faint puffs of campfire smoke, they dismounted and moved toward a small knoll, and Burdock retrieved a strange tube with a glass lens at each end and looked through it. "I would say it is in fact our quarry," said Burdock. The road was clearly visible from the enemy's camp, just over 100 yards away. It was likely that enemy spies were watching the route, so Losgrel and his team would have to divert off the road to remain hidden. Losgrel and Burdock rode back to the others, who had dismounted and were stretching their cramped limbs. "Follow my lead. We are going off-road until we get around their position. We will set up camp ahead on the opposite side of them. We will have to work quickly to get the decoys set up before nightfall," said the knight. Burdock cast a spell of unseeing to reduce their chances of being spotted as they passed by the enemies. After a series of incantations from a long-forgotten language, a dark fog emanated from Burdock's staff and passed through everyone present, followed by a faint whisper. "Hush," breathed a faint voice as the fog passed through them. "We must move slowly and swiftly as we pass by. The spell loses efficacy the faster one moves," said the wizard. The group veered off the main road 500 yards before the enemy's encampment. Moving southeast adjacent to the road, they traveled single file, meticulously taking care not to stir up any dust. They went several hundred yards east along the road before settling on a flat area that was concealed by a small hill. There, they set up camp and built a fire pit which they would set ablaze at sundown. There was about 3 hours of daylight left when they hurriedly began making the decoys. Bramble and tumbleweed were gathered and stuffed into the extra garments of the horsemen, looking like an army of scarecrows. Longfellow's skillfully crafted faces out of dried pieces of wood found scattered about the area and placed them atop of the scarecrows. The decoys were set up on both sides of the road, 9 on each side, but set far enough back so they were not readily seen unless one looked carefully. By the time they were finished, it was dusk, and tired and cold from their labor, they went to their camp. 2 at a time, they took shifts all throughout the night and morning to watch the enemy encampment for signs of movement. Tension filled the air as everyone tried to rest, but no one slept for more than an hour at a time. Burdock prepared a special tea which induced a brief but deep sleep for those who did manage to doze off. Mylo's dreams were plagued by visions of the dreaded beast from his earlier vision. Mylo awoke just before dawn to see most of his companions asleep around the fire. He was happy to see that everyone got sleep at least to some degree, but regretted the fact that he was the first awake, other than those keeping watch over the enemy. "Good morning, Mylo," said a cheerful yet unfamiliar voice. Mylo checked again to see if anyone else had awoken yet, but saw no one. "Who is there?" "Who said that?" said Mylo as he arose and looked around. "It is me, Jack," said the voice. You can talk," said Mylo, who was beginning to wonder if he was dreaming. "Of course I can talk," said Jack, who was now waving his trunk visibly. "But until recently, you were unable to hear me." "But how?" said Mylo in bewilderment. "An Enoi companion should be able to communicate with his Enoi," said Jack. "But for some reason, something was preventing it. Perhaps he lacked the faith, or maybe something else. I am surprised Yoshime didn't speak of it to you. But the important thing is, you can hear me now. Try talking to me with your mind before you wake up all and sundry," Jack encouraged. "Okay," said Mylo out loud. In his mind he tried to think of something to say to Jack. "I'll ask him if he is hungry," he thought. "No thank you," said Jack. "I was grazing before you awoke." "Whoa! Can you hear all of my thoughts?" Mylo asked. "Oh, goodness, no. Only if your thought is directed toward me can I hear it. And when you are in pain or distress, I can feel it," said the elephant. "So, if I get hurt today, you would feel the pain?" asked Mylo. "Well, I wouldn't exactly feel the pain, but I would definitely know about it," said Jack, as daylight began to break and a few of the others began to stir. As he struggled to come to grips with the concept of elephant communication, he sat and wrapped himself in his blanket and awaited briefing on the day's plans. Soon Losgrel and Burdock were awake and encouraged everyone to take in nourishment to prepare for what was to come. Burdock passed around the last of the elixirs he and Raller had prepared, saying, "We must avail ourselves of every advantage that we have." After breakfast, Mylo heard the others buzzing about the fact that the enemy was awake and that they anticipated them to break down their camp and head out. Burdock retrieved a small black and gold spell book and began reciting a lengthy incantation that he called the Spell of Convincing, which was geared toward making the ruse more believable to the enemy. Losgrel and Andanine approached, each man giving orders to mount up and be on the ready. The enemy had begun to break down their encampment as tensions ran high. Mylo's heart began to race as adrenaline pumped through him. They all remained on alert for what seemed like an eternity. Slowly, the seconds ticked on until they felt the rumble of many hooves as they kicked up dust and made their way to the rail path. "Positions," said Losgrel in a quiet yet authoritative tone. Andanine and 4 of his men, along with Losgrel, Burdock, Mylo, Longfellow, and Jack rode ahead, beyond the decoys, and waited behind a grove of alders. "On my signal," whispered Losgrel, "we ride out into the road." Behind the alders, they lingered, tensions on high as they awaited Losgrel's signal. They could hear the approaching enemy horsemen as they grew closer. Longfellow gripped his sheathed sword, as if hanging on for his very life. Sweat beaded up on Mylo's forehead as a sense of lightness grew in his stomach. When the enemy approached about 100 yards from their position behind the alders, Losgrel outstretched his arm and pointed toward the road, the signal they had been waiting for. "This is it, I guess," whispered Mylo as they slowly marched out onto the road. Once on the road, one by one they turned 90 degrees to face the enemy. Losgrel, in the middle, Andanine and 2 of his men to his right, and 2 other horsemen to his left they stood. Burdock was positioned just behind Losgrel, his staff elevated and pulsating with a reddish-orange glow. Mylo and Longfellow, mounted on Jack, settled behind Burdock. They watched as the enemy gradually slowed their pace, finally coming to a halt. Mylo could see the waterfowler's breath billowing from its nostrils, swirling like a thick fog in the cold air. Muted murmurs echoed from the enemy's ranks as Losgrel rode forward a few paces. Burdock began to whisper another incantation, closing his eyes and lifting his staff high as Losgrel prepared to address the foe. "Raybor Wolf, son of Alvadine," Losgrel called, his voice firm and clear. At that moment, the prince, mounted on the waterfowler, stepped forward, flanked by 2 horsemen. Mylo felt a shiver of fear as adrenaline surged through him. The beast's glowing eyes seemed to bore into his soul. "We're here to place you and your men under arrest. You are charged with impersonating COL officers," said the knight sternly. "You will step down from your horses, lay down your weapons, and come forward." "You are surrounded and outnumbered," said Losgrel, gesturing at the decoys on the side of the road. The rest of Andanine's men made their presence known as they marched out behind the enemy's horses. Raybor's men looked around at the decoys to the side and the horsemen behind them. Zokir was the first to speak. "This is very serious business, my prince. We seem to be outnumbered. Perhaps we should surrender. We would only be detained for a short time. Your father would see to that. It is my thought that the mission is a failure. If we fight, even if we win, word of our plan would most certainly get out." "Unless we were to kill every last one of them," said Raybor as his gaze fell upon the horseman by his other side. To his left sat a new wizard, Pavar's replacement, Silthar the Black. Silthar eyed Raybor, the lower portion of his face obscured by a covering. "How did they know of our plan? How did they know we would come this way?" asked the prince. "They travel with a wizard as well," hissed the dark wizard as he examined a twisted staff which was alight with an ominous red glow. "The wizard must have foreseen our plan, and I presume he is the reason why I did not sense their presence. You can make this easy or difficult for yourselves. It is your choice," said Losgrel before glancing back at Burdock. Raybor, Zokir, and Silthar rode forward a few more steps. "Perhaps it is you whom it will be difficult for," said the prince in his native tongue. "My lord, perhaps we should make some attempt at negotiating," warned Zokir, his voice wavering. Raybor again looked over at his new wizard. "Not just yet, my lord. I sense something is not quite right here, but I cannot put my finger on it," hissed Silthar. The prince whispered something to Zokir. "The prince has vowed never to speak the common tongue." "My lord asks why we should surrender to you," asked Zokir. Burdock rode up alongside Losgrel. "Their wizard is more powerful than I anticipated." "I don't think they are buying our ruse," said Burdock. As the two discussed their next course of action, Longfellow began to dismount. "Mylo, I know what you think is going to happen next." "I cannot stand by and watch you die," he said as he drew his sword and began to walk toward the enemy. Losgrel immediately rode in front of Longfellow to intercept him, and the two began to argue. Taking advantage of the distraction, Mylo and Jack rode forward. Mylo's adrenaline was surging, and Jack sensed it. "Waterfowler are tough, but not that smart, Mylo. Just stay centered," said Jack. "I am sorry I got you into this, Jack, but here we go," said Mylo. "Raybor Wolf," said Mylo as he continued forward. "Do you recognize me?" The prince instantly knew he was looking at the one responsible for the death of his beloved lady, and his heart was filled with rage, his usual calm and cold demeanor abandoning him. His encoloi growled and hissed and stomped its mighty hooves as it awaited its master's command. Asa, began Raybor in his native language. "Ist isa contora ist isa senora hydezera animak idriaxlani Atlandiana." "My lord says he should have killed you back at the walled city," said Zokir. Mylo's gaze became fixed on Raybor as if he was taken over by some unseen force, the Norn or perhaps some other god. He was fully in that moment, without fear of injury or death. The task before him was all that existed. Not a thought went through his mind, for if he had to think about what was about to happen, he might have backed out. "Then, perhaps your lord would like another opportunity," said Mylo in a calm tone, not taking his eyes off the prince. "Let us fight now, just you and me, and settle all of this. If you win, you go free. If I win, you go with us and stand trial." "In easy victory, your highness," whispered Zokir. Turning to look ahead to Loskrel, he asked, "And what of the rest of us?" Loskrel glanced at Burdock and Burdock gave a nod. "No matter who wins, your men are free to go," said Loskrel. "Do we have your word?" asked Zokir after the prince whispered inaudibly to him. "You have our word," said the knight. Burdock rode a few steps toward Mylo. "Mylo, you don't have to do this," he pleaded. Mylo, not looking back, spoke in a soft, nearly inaudible tone, "This is the only way." Burdock bowed his head slightly and fell back. "Everyone, clear the road." "Give them some space," exclaimed Zokir. "Each of you, back up 200 feet, the standard distance. When the horn is sounded, the duel will begin," he added, riding to the approximate center between the two. Before long, Mylo and Jack were the only ones remaining on the road beside their enemy. As they rode toward the estimated 200-foot mark, Mylo took long, deep breaths to center himself. "Okay, Jack, so now what?" he said between breaths. "Life is full of moments," began the inner voice, which was Jack. "Some moments are for rest, some for play, some for eating, but this moment we fight," said the elephant. "Let's hope it isn't the moment to die," said Mylo as they got into position. "I don't think that will be our fate. But death is just another door." "I mean, no one really dies," said Jack. "I don't understand," said Mylo as he drew his sword. "I will explain later. If we don't die," said Jack. Off to the side, Burdock, with one hand holding a small spell book, the other, he held outward, his palm facing Mylo, began to softly whisper a long spell or prayer. Loskrel and the others looked on in helpless anticipation of the duel which was about to play out. On the other side, Silthar was similarly reading from a black and red spell book and praying over Raybor and the evil beast. Mylo watched as the prince skillfully maneuvered his sword as he eyed Mylo. After what seemed like an eternity, the horn sounded and the waterfowler began to charge. Instinctively, Jack began to charge as well. Just then, something happened to Mylo that he had never experienced before. Everything to the side of his field of vision seemed to fade. All that seemed to exist was the prince and the charging beast. Even the sounds around him seemed to diminish. For a moment he wondered if something was stuck in his ears, wax or cotton perhaps. Longfellow covered his eyes as the dueling foes drew closer while Loskrel clenched his fist in angst. Burdock's prayers quickened to a frenzied pace as the thundering beast galloped. Mylo saw the glimmer of the sun's rays hitting Raybor's sword as he lifted it high as he prepared to swing. Mylo lifted his sword just in time as a loud clang of metal on metal rang out through the arid landscape. Mylo's arm, almost numb, tingled from the impact from blocking the attack. Barely staying mounted on the elephant, he readjusted himself and circled back to the starting position for the second round. "That was far too close," whispered Burdock before returning to the spell book. His center of gravity was too high. "Assume a lower posture," exclaimed Loskrel, directing his voice toward Mylo. Immediately, the waterfowler began to charge, its massive limbs battering the dusty road. This time, Mylo took a more offensive approach. He raised his sword high as he passed and swung with all his might, aiming right for the prince's neck. Another deafening crash of metal sounded off, barely blocked by the gold buckler worn on Raybor's left arm, rocking his torso backward. Burdock glanced at Loskrel, beaming with a new confidence. Once again, both sides went back to their starting points. Looking across at his foe, Mylo saw the prince lean down and whisper something to his dark Enoi and petted it on its side. The horn sounded again and the third charge began. As they got closer, Mylo saw Raybor posturing up to deliver a powerful swing of his sword. When it appeared as if the sword was coming right at him, he leaned off to his left to dodge the sword, but the beast suddenly turned to its left and swung its mighty tail right into Jack's path, tripping him. Mylo, who had been leaning off to the side, went tumbling down to the ground, rolling several times from the momentum. The air knocked out of his lungs, he gasped for air. "Mylo," he heard Jack say, "are you all right?" Before he could answer, he heard the pounding of the beast's feet against the ground. Closer and closer it came. Adrenaline pushing him, he sprang up to his feet only to see the prince and the Enkaloi almost upon him. They were coming with so much speed, there was no time to move out of the way. The beast's eyes seemed to penetrate him. Not sure if remembering it from his vision or if he actually was hearing it, he distinctly heard the snarling of the beast. "I am the destroyer of Mylo T. Cobb." Just when the beast was only yards from him, there was a tremendous thud followed by the sight of the prince tumbling over him. It was Jack. He had intercepted them, coming between Mylo and the charging enemies, marked by a horrible sound of metal clanging and flesh tearing and an awful shriek. Jack was knocked onto his side, just in front of Mylo, who had fallen backward in an attempt to get out of the way. The injured waterfowler went tumbling adjacent to Mylo and Raybor was thrown 15 feet behind him. Mylo lay there in awe of what just happened before him. He heard coughing and movement behind him. It was Raybor who was attempting to stand and regain his composure. The prince began toward Mylo, his sword drawn. Mylo's own sword was out of reach behind him, closer to Raybor than himself. There was no way he could get to it. He was defenseless. The prince slowly approached. "Now to finish this once and for all," said the prince in his native tongue. Just when Mylo thought it was indeed finished, he remembered his slingshot still in his jacket pocket. Without a second thought, he snatched it out of his pocket, along with an iron marble he had made back at the forge, and just when Raybor was upon him, he pulled back the sling and with a loud pop, fired the marble at the prince. Immediately, the prince dropped his sword and cried out in pain, covering his eye. He cursed and cried out in his Venusian dialect while Mylo dashed past him and retrieved his sword. Raybor, still wincing in pain, picked up his sword and lunged at Mylo, swinging his sword in anger. Mylo parried and countered with an attack of his own, stabbing the prince just under the armpit where his armor ended. As Mylo withdrew the sword from Raybor's flesh, the prince swung in vain, hitting only air. He felt his knees clutching his bleeding wound. Mylo stared down at the wounded prince. He wanted nothing more than to exact judgment upon Raybor right then and there, but he needed the prince alive if he ever wanted to return to Atlantia as a free man. Raybor was responsible for the fire that was intended to kill Mylo, and he needed his confession. The others wanted him alive so that he could stand trial for attempting to start a war and impersonating COL officers, but that was secondary to Mylo. He held his sword pointed at the prince and waited for the others to restrain him. The prince looked up at Mylo and in Venusian said, "Kill me now, Atlantean, while you still have the chance." To Raybor's amazement, Mylo replied to him in Venusian, "No, it is not my place to take your life as much as you may deserve it. You will stand trial," said Mylo. Just then, Zokir and a few horsemen raced toward their injured comrade while Andanine and his men made haste to intercept Zokir. Zokir rode right between them, causing Mylo to leap out of the way to avoid being trampled. Raybor was lifted and put on the back of a horse. A brief exchange of arrows passed between the two sides as the enemy rallied around Zokir as he rescued the prince. Mylo stood up to see Loskrel, Andanine, and the others racing toward them. They gave chase for a short distance only, not wanting the enemy to realize that they were not outnumbered as it had originally seemed. Loskrel returned to assess the situation, making sure Mylo was uninjured. 2 of Raybor's men lay dead, a result of arrows from Andanine and his men. 2 horses had also fallen, and 2 of Andanine's men were injured. The dazed, wounded waterfowler scrambled to its feet and limped away in the direction of the enemy, but Jack lay there on the ground, bleeding from his side. Mylo watched as his only hope at redemption and returning to his homeland rode off into the distance. He was momentarily crushed until the reality that Jack was seriously injured hit him. "Jack," cried Mylo, "are you okay? You saved my life." I am not sure," said Jack as Burdock began removing Jack's armor. "If not for the armor, Jack might not have survived, but the waterfowler's horn seems to have broken through," yelled Burdock as he began to treat the wound. "Will he be okay?" cried Mylo as he fell onto his knees near Burdock. "I think so. We just need to get the bleeding to stop. I have a healing blend here with me, but it was only meant for human wounds. This wound will require a lot more. Go and find yarrow or goldenrod. There's plenty of it around here, and water. Lots of water." Longfellow brought over the remaining water they had and went to fetch more, while Mylo and a few others went to look for the herbs. Loskrel and Andanine stood guard in case the enemy should return. Within the hour, Burdock finally managed to get the bleeding stopped, but it wasn't until nearly dusk when Jack was well enough to get up and out of the road. 3 travelers using the road offered to help, but there was really nothing they could do. As the sun began to go down, after talking with Jack, Mylo approached the others who were sitting on the side of the road. "Jack says he is ready to move. He has been feeling better since his nap," said Mylo. "I hope he can walk at least far enough off the road so we can make camp. I don't want to be anywhere near the road if they decide to return with more men," said Loskrel, his impatience evident. Jack arose slowly and the group began to mount up and ride north of the rail trail, Jack limping as they went. Daylight was beginning to fade and Burdock lit his staff to guide their way. The daunting and slow walk went on for over an hour when they finally settled upon an old dugout foundation where a house once stood and made their camp. They set up a tent large enough for Jack, ensuring that his wound would stay dry and heal. After 1 week, Jack was feeling well enough to make the long trip back to the walled city, and the 2 wounded horsemen also had healed.